Bernie Madoff ran the largest Ponzi scheme in history, which at its height had an apparent $65 billion in assets under management, made up of investments by everybody from Wall Street billionaires to pension funds. This all came crashing down in December of 2008, as the fraudulent businessman was arrested and subsequently charged to face over 100 years in prison, a sentence that he served up until his death last month. But here's the thing. Bernie's fraud was not that bad. In fact, there was arguably more damaging behavior taking place in the markets day in and day out by some of the most revered businessmen in the world. To understand this, it's time to learn how money works by defending the indefensible to really understand how Bernie Madoff ran his business. So, the basic function of a Ponzi scheme is that a legitimate operation is set up to attract investors to make a nice healthy return. Now, this operation could theoretically purport to do anything. Shipping, mining, manufacturing, but more often than not, it is investing. Why investing? Because it is the most discreet. You see, you will never actually perform any of the tasks that you claim you will to the investors, and an investment firm doing nothing looks pretty much identical to an investment firm doing a lot, at least from the outside. Compare that to a factory, which becomes pretty obvious when it isn't doing anything. The whole scheme works by raising money, and then paying out made-up returns to previous investors, all in order to attract new investors whose money will be used to pay out the existing investors. This is not to be confused with the pyramid scheme, which also attracts unsuspecting victims to invest in a dubious organization. The difference is that pyramid schemes make these investors recruit more investors in return for their payout, whereas Ponzi schemes say you don't need to do anything but give us money, and in return we promise a payout from these other business ventures that aren't actually taking place. The two are very similar in a lot of ways, but if it looks like a triangle that tiers members above or below one another, it's a pyramid scheme. A Ponzi scheme is normally a lot harder to spot, but it works as we saw earlier, by promising great returns to an ever-growing pool of investors. The problem with this scheme is that, of course, it never actually generates any returns, so it needs to keep on attracting more and more investors in order to pay out returns to past investors. Now, attracting these investors is a bit of a balancing act. You need to offer returns that are attractive and consistent, there needs to be a good reason for people to invest with you over just throwing their money into a broad market index fund. But you don't want to make these returns too attractive for a few reasons. For starters, offering 50% returns year on year is going to look suspicious, especially to the types of sophisticated investors and institutions that will be investing into these schemes. The other thing is that offering higher returns means that your scheme has to grow a lot faster. A fund that offered 50% return on investment and started out with nothing but a small loan of $1 million would only take about 40 years before needing more money than exists on Earth to pay out investors. Madoff decided that the key to his plan was striking this balance at around 12% annualized return. And to sweeten the deal, he offered consistency of return, which is, of course, very easy when your whole business doesn't actually need to do anything. This was still a very attractive offering, and given his status as the previous chairman of the Nasdaq, combined with a stable investing track record, Madoff had no problem attracting more and more investors over time. Hypothetically, without legal intervention, he could have run this scheme until he died, which was most probably what his plan was. But you might ask, how do you plan to defend someone like this? Someone who is clearly and knowingly running a criminally fraudulent organization, someone who squandered the life savings of thousands of victims, and someone who did everything in his power to cover up this reality. Well, the thing is, despite the flashy headlines, he didn't really do that much damage. You see, most of the investors in his fund continually reinvested their earnings back into the fund. What this meant was that Bernie didn't need to find 12% every year to pay out. In reality, it was less than 1% per year over the time that the scheme was operating. This apparent reinvestment of returns is what allowed the fund to balloon in size to over $60 billion, and the people were happy to keep their money with Bernie because nobody else on Wall Street could consistently give them such stable returns. This $60 billion figure is not how much money was actually lost, it's how much money people think they lost by going off their worthless accounts with Bernie's firm. In reality, the total payments made by victims to the scheme was only about $17 billion according to former SEC Chairman Harvey Pitt. Now, $17 billion is still an astronomical amount of money, but that's not the end of the story. You see, when this all came crashing down after Madoff's arrest, this money hadn't really gone anywhere. Some of it had been spent on business operations, paying staff and renting their fancy-looking offices to keep up appearances. Some of it had been spent on maintaining Madoff's lavish lifestyle, and of course, some of it had been paid out to investors, but as we saw earlier, not that much. In fact, as a part of the recovery process, the SEC called back all payments and withdrawals made by the fund in the 6 years before 2008. This meant that had someone cashed out their supposed gains in 2005, they would have put them into the communal pot of cash, whether they were complicit in the scheme or not. The authorities also tried their best to weed out unsuspecting victims from early investors, who were fully aware of what was going on, but were more than happy to play along in order to keep the money pouring in. The latter obviously had their gain seized. In fact, Madoff wasn't actually the largest beneficiary of the fraud. That honor went to Jeffrey Pacauer, who died shortly after the fraud was revealed in unrelated circumstances. His estate ended up settling with the victims of the scheme for a total of $7.2 billion, which was the largest single asset forfeiture in American history. The combination of all of this was that over $14 billion were eventually recovered and dispersed to the victims of the fraud. Of course, it's hard to know exactly how much money was lost, because it should go without saying that the firm did not exactly keep accurate financial documents, but best estimates are now reporting that most people got back about 80% of what they put into it, which is not a great return, especially compared to the 12% the victims thought they were getting, but it's not terrible. People lose that all the time by investing into funds that are trying to do the right thing, but just don't execute on their investments correctly. Perhaps even more relevant than that is people today investing for themselves by following the directions of billionaire business leaders. The cryptocurrency market recently suffered value losses of over $800 billion from its peak within a matter of days. Now, there were obviously a few factors at play here, but at least one of them was a major decision reversal by a certain rocket man. Now, of course, the circumstances were different, and I don't want to conflate the practices of Madoff and Musk, because one was obviously far more knowingly malicious, but in terms of net damage, let's check the scorecard. Let's be really forgiving and assume that Musk's tweet was only responsible for 5% of the market crash in cryptocurrencies. That would still be over $40 billion worth of value damages spread out amongst millions of unsophisticated investors, versus poor old Bernie here with less than $4 billion in damages spread out amongst 24,000 victims who were all sophisticated investors and should have known better, at least according to investing standards. Anyway, as far as slimy businesses operate, this one probably isn't worth the risks, at least in part because it involves taking lots of money off rich people with lots of big scary lawyers and influence. There is much more money to be made taking a little bit of money off of a lot of poor people who are too poor to do shit about it. Go and watch our video on how multi-level marketing companies get away with doing exactly this, and make sure to like and subscribe to keep on learning how money works. What's the difference between Bernie Sanders and Bernie Madoff? Only one of them could properly tax some rich people.